In the heart of Delhi, India, standing within the ancient Qutub complex, rises a structure that defies everything we think we know about metal. It's a pillar, 7 meters tall, 6 tons of pure iron, and it has stood exposed to wind, rain, monsoons, and scorching heat for over 1,600 years without a single trace of rust. Not one fleck of corrosion, not one mark of decay. If you were to leave an iron nail outside your house today, it would rust within weeks. Modern iron bridges require constant maintenance and protective coatings, or they crumble. The Eiffel Tower needs to be repainted every 7 years with 60 tons of paint, just to protect it from oxidation. Yet here stands this ancient pillar, naked to the elements since the year 400 AD, looking as pristine as the day it was forged. This shouldn't be possible. Iron oxidizes, it's chemistry. It's inevitable. Or so we thought. For over a century, scientists, metallurgists, and engineers from around the world have studied this pillar, trying to solve a mystery that seems to mock our modern understanding of materials science. Some proposed the climate, others suggested ancient secrets lost to time. A few even claimed alien technology. But the truth, when it was finally discovered, revealed something far more extraordinary. The sophisticated genius of ancient Indian blacksmiths who understood chemistry and metallurgy at a level that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. This is the story of the Iron Pillar of Delhi. One structure, one incredible mystery, and the stunning revelation that changed everything we thought we knew about ancient technology. The Iron Pillar stands today in the courtyard of the Quwat al-Islam Mosque, part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site known as the Qutub complex. Tourists photograph it daily, marvelling at its height and the intricate Sanskrit inscriptions carved into its surface. But most have no idea they're looking at what metallurgists call one of the most significant technological achievements of the ancient world. The pillar measures exactly 7.221 meters from base to capital. That's nearly 24 feet tall. The portion visible above ground is 17 feet, with another 3 feet 8 inches buried deep in the earth. At its base, the pillar has a diameter of 16.7 inches, tapering gracefully to 1185 inches just below its decorative capital. The capital itself is a beautiful bell-shaped structure, ornately decorated with patterns that showcase the artistic sensibilities of its creators. But here's what makes it truly remarkable. This entire structure weighs 6,114 kilograms, over 13,000 pounds, and it's composed of 98% pure wrought iron. Not steel, not some mysterious alloy, just iron with a secret. The pillar was erected during the reign of Chandragupta II, one of the most powerful emperors of the Gupta dynasty. History knows him by another name, Vikramaditya, meaning son of valour. He ruled from 375 to 415 AD, during what scholars call the Golden Age of India, a period of unprecedented prosperity, scientific advancement, and cultural flourishing that would shape Indian civilization for centuries to come. To understand the Iron Pillar, you need to understand the world that created it. The Gupta Empire wasn't just another kingdom. It was a civilization at its absolute zenith, a society so confident in its abilities, so wealthy in its resources, so advanced in its knowledge that it could undertake projects purely for glory and devotion. Chandragupta II inherited an already formidable empire from his father, Samudragupta, who had conquered over 20 kingdoms and earned the title Maharajadiraja, King of Kings. But Chandragupta II expanded it further, defeating the western Kshatrapas and extending Gupta control from the mouth of the Ganges River in the east to the Indus River in the west, from the Himalayas in the north to the Narmada River in the south. His coins, minted in gold and silver, described him as Parama Bhagavata, meaning supreme devotee of Vishnu. This wasn't mere political propaganda. Chandragupta II appears to have been genuinely religious, commissioning temples, supporting Brahmin priests, and erecting monuments like the Iron Pillar to honour his patron deity. His court was legendary. The sources speak of the Navaratna, the 9 jewels, 9 extraordinary scholars who adorned his court and pushed the boundaries of human knowledge in multiple fields. Kalidasa, considered the greatest poet and dramatist in the Sanskrit language, wrote during this period. His play, Shakuntala, tells the story of a king who falls in love with a forest maiden, forgets her under a curse, and later recognizes her through a ring. The play is so beautifully constructed, so emotionally resonant, that when German writer Johann von Goethe read it in translation, over 400 years later, he was moved to write, "If you want to know the flowering of heaven and earth in one name, I say Shakuntala, and all is said." Aryabhata, one of the first great Indian mathematician astronomers, lived during the Gupta period. He calculated pi to 4 decimal places, understood that the Earth rotated on its axis rather than the Sun revolving around Earth, and developed solutions to algebraic equations that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for 1,000 years. Vatsyayana composed the Kama Sutra not merely as a manual of sexual positions as modern popular culture often portrays it, but as a sophisticated philosophical treatise on desire, relationships, and the art of living well. Vishnu Sharma authored the Panchatantra, a collection of animal fables with moral lessons that has been translated into more languages than any other non-religious book in human history. This was the world that created the Iron Pillar, a world where mathematics, astronomy, literature, art, architecture, and metallurgy all flourished simultaneously. A world with the wealth to commission massive projects, the knowledge to execute them brilliantly, and the confidence to believe they would endure forever. The Sanskrit inscription on the pillar tells us this much. Written in the elegant Gupta script, each letter carefully chiselled into the rust-resistant iron, it praises a king named Chandra. The full inscription reads, in translation, "He whose feet were washed by the waters of the 7 oceans, who conquered the Valikas in battle, whose fame even today spreads everywhere, who by force of might subdued the enemy in battle, and who, having enjoyed the earth, has set his mind upon the highest good. That Chandra, whose glory remains undiminished, has raised this standard of Lord Vishnu on the hill known as Vishnupada." The inscription is itself a work of art. It's composed in the difficult Shardulvikridita meter, a Sanskrit poetic form requiring precise syllable counts and specific patterns of long and short vowels. Creating poetry in this meter demands not just literary skill, but mathematical precision. The letters vary from 0.3 to 0.5 inches in size and are carved with such clarity that they remain easily readable after 1,600 years. The choice to inscribe the pillar in Sanskrit, the language of scholarship and religion, rather than the vernacular languages spoken by common people, reveals the pillar's intended audience. Not the masses, but the educated elite, the Brahmin priests, and royal court members, who could read and appreciate the poetic complexity. The inscription describes Chandragupta II's military achievements. He conquered the Vahlikas, likely referring to his victories over peoples living beyond the Sindhu River, in what is now Pakistan. He subdued enemies in battle and enjoyed the earth, references to his extensive conquests that brought prosperity and tribute flowing into the Gupta treasury. But the inscription's most important revelation comes in its final lines. After all these worldly achievements, the king set his mind upon the highest good. This suggests a spiritual transformation, a turning away from conquest toward devotion. The pillar, then, marks not just a military victory, but a personal spiritual journey. In Hindu tradition, life is divided into 4 ashramas or stages: brahmacharya, student; grihastha, householder; vanaprastha, retiree; and sannyasa, renunciant. Some scholars believe the inscription indicates that Chandragupta II, having fulfilled his duties as warrior and king, was entering the vanaprastha stage, preparing to withdraw from worldly affairs and focus on spiritual matters. The location he chose for the pillar, Vishnupada, or the hill of Vishnu's footprints, was deeply significant. According to Hindu tradition, certain places bear the marks of divine presence, where gods walked upon the earth and left their traces. These sites become pilgrimage destinations, places where the boundary between human and divine grows thin. Udayagiri, where the pillar was likely first erected, contains a series of caves carved during the Gupta period. One cave features a massive relief sculpture of Vishnu in his Varaha avatar as a giant boar rescuing the goddess Earth from the cosmic ocean. The sculpture is monumental, over 20 feet tall, and is considered one of the finest examples of Gupta art. The pillar probably stood near this sculpture, perhaps in a courtyard before the cave, with a statue of Garuda, Vishnu's eagle mount, fixed atop the decorative capital. Pilgrims would have approached the sacred site, first seeing the towering iron standard, the Vishnu Dvaja, announcing the god's presence, then entering the caves to view the divine images carved into living rock. This was devotional architecture, on a grand scale, designed to inspire awe and devotion, to demonstrate the king's piety and his empire's capabilities simultaneously. The technical challenges of creating such a monument were formidable. The pillar had to be massive enough to impress, tall enough to be visible from a distance, perfectly vertical to stand without support, and durable enough to endure forever as a testament to both divine power and royal glory. But where was this sacred hill? Not in Delhi. Archaeological evidence and textual analysis have revealed something fascinating. The iron pillar wasn't originally erected where it stands today. Its first home was likely the Udayagiri caves in Madhya Pradesh, a site deeply associated with Chandragupta II and Vishnu worship during the Gupta period. This area, in central India, was a centre of iron mining and metallurgy, a place where ancient Indian blacksmiths had perfected their craft over millennia. Sometime around the 11th century AD, a Delhi sultan named Anangpal Tomar had the pillar moved from its original location to Delhi. Imagine that undertaking. Moving a 6-ton iron pillar over 300 miles without cranes, without trucks, without modern machinery. How was it done? We don't know for certain. But somehow, this massive structure was transported and re-erected in what would become the courtyard of a new mosque. When the Delhi Sultanate built the Quwwatul Islam Mosque in 1192 AD, after conquering the region, they incorporated the pillar into the complex. Not as their own achievement, but as a trophy, a testament to the greatness of the civilization they had conquered. The mosque itself was constructed using materials from 27 Hindu and Jain temples that were demolished, but the iron pillar remained standing, untouched, eternal. And as the centuries passed, as empires rose and fell around it, as Delhi transformed from medieval sultanate to Mughal capital to British colonial city to modern metropolis, the pillar stood unchanged. While the mosque around it crumbled into picturesque ruins, while stone weathered and eroded, while marble stained and iron weapons rusted into dust, this one pillar remained pristine. By the early 20th century, the scientific world began to take notice. When British colonial scientists first examined the pillar in 1912, they were baffled. Modern chemistry had revealed that iron exposed to oxygen and moisture inevitably forms iron oxide, rust, the red-brown flaking that destroys iron structures, that requires constant vigilance and maintenance, that costs the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars every year in corrosion control. Yet here stood proof that such corrosion wasn't inevitable, and the question that consumed researchers for the next century was simple but profound. Why the first theories focused on the environment? Perhaps some suggested Delhi's climate was responsible for the pillar's preservation. The city is indeed relatively dry, with low humidity for much of the year. Scientists know from decades of corrosion research that iron doesn't rust significantly when relative humidity remains below 70%. In Delhi, humidity exceeds 70% for only about 65 days per year, and exceeds 80% for only about 20 days. During the dry season, the atmosphere is so arid that moisture has little chance to settle on metal surfaces for extended periods. The monsoon season brings rain, but also brings drying winds that quickly evaporate water from exposed surfaces. Could this explain it? Could Delhi's climate alone protect the pillar? It was a tempting theory, simple, clean, but it had problems. Other iron structures in Delhi and across India had rusted extensively despite experiencing the same climate. The iron beams in the temples of Puri and Konark, erected just 700 years ago, had undergone extensive corrosion. British-era ironworks throughout the city required constant maintenance. Even other ancient iron objects found in the region showed normal patterns of rust and decay. If climate were the answer, why would this one pillar be immune while everything else corroded normally? There had to be something else, something about the pillar itself. And so researchers turned their attention to the iron. What was it made of? How was it made? Were there secrets in its composition that modern science had missed? In 1963, M.K. Ghosh of India's National Metallurgical Laboratory conducted the first detailed metallurgical analysis of the pillar. Using samples from the base where the surface was rough, he examined the microscopic structure of the iron under powerful microscopes and subjected it to chemical analysis. What he found was surprising. The iron was unusually pure, with very low carbon content. But it also contained something modern. Iron typically lacks phosphorus at levels around 0.25%, reaching as high as 1% in some samples. That's 5 times higher than modern iron produced in blast furnaces, which typically contains less than 0.05% phosphorus. Modern metallurgists consider phosphorus an impurity. It makes iron brittle, harder to work with, less desirable for construction. In modern steel production, extensive effort goes into removing phosphorus because it can cause problems with weldability and ductility. But here it was, in relatively high concentrations, in one of the most durable iron structures ever created. Could this impurity actually be the key? Ghosh also discovered something remarkable about how the pillar was constructed. The surface showed hammer marks, evidence of forge welding. This was no cast iron structure poured molten into a mould. Instead, the ancient blacksmiths had built it piece by piece, heating lumps of iron in charcoal furnaces until they were red hot and plastic, then hammering them together, welding them through sheer force and heat into a unified whole. Ghosh estimated that each lump of iron weighed between 44 and 66 pounds, roughly 20 to 30 kilograms. The pillar contains hundreds of these pieces, all forge welded together. He calculated that approximately 120 labourers would have worked for 2 weeks to construct the pillar, maintaining fires hot enough to keep the iron at welding temperature, hammering continuously, shaping the structure as it grew, section by section, in a massive coordinated effort that speaks to extraordinary organisational ability and technical knowledge. Let's pause to appreciate what this means. Forge welding requires heating iron to approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough that the metal becomes plastic and can be joined by hammering, but iron melts at 1,539 degrees Celsius. The ancient smiths had to maintain temperatures in a narrow range, hot enough for welding but cool enough that the iron didn't melt or burn away. They achieved this using charcoal furnaces powered by bellows. Multiple furnaces would have operated simultaneously, each one maintaining its critical temperature range. As one lump of iron reached welding temperature, it would be removed with tongs, placed atop the growing pillar, and immediately hammered by multiple workers, striking in coordination to weld it to the piece below before it cooled too much. This process requires split-second timing and perfect coordination. If the iron cools too much, the weld won't take, and the joint will be weak. If it's heated too long, the metal oxidizes excessively, creating slag that prevents proper joining. The smiths had to know, by iron experience, the exact moment when the iron was ready, that perfect cherry red colour that indicates welding temperature. The bottom 2 feet of the pillar show rough texture with visible hammer marks. This wasn't poor craftsmanship. This roughness was intentional, designed to help the pillar grip the ground when buried. The smiths understood that a smooth surface might slip or rotate, but a rough textured surface would lock into place once earth was packed around it. Above ground level, the pillar's surface is smooth and polished, requiring additional work after the forge welding was complete. The smiths used chisels and burnishing tools to create this refined surface, removing the rough scale and hammer marks, creating a finish appropriate for a royal monument. The decorative bell, capital at the top, is itself a metallurgical marvel. Detailed analysis by Professor Balasubramaniam revealed that it's not a single piece, but is composed of separate components, each individually forge welded and then fitted together around a cylindrical, hollow iron shaft. This shaft connected to the main body of the pillar through an insert system, allowing the heavy capital to be attached securely to the pillar's top. The capital features intricate decorative elements, including floral patterns and geometric designs, demonstrating that the ancient smiths possessed not just technical metallurgical skills, but artistic sensibilities. They could forge weld with precision, creating joints so perfect that the capital appears to be a single, unified piece. At the very top of the capital, there's a deep socket, and historical records suggest that a statue of Garuda, Vishnu's eagle mount, was originally fixed into this socket. The pillar would thus have been even taller, perhaps reaching 25 or 26 feet when the Garuda statue was in place, making it even more impressive to ancient viewers. But why forge weld instead of casting? The answer reveals the limitations and the genius of ancient Indian metallurgy. Iron melts at 1,539 degrees Celsius, 2,802 degrees Fahrenheit. Ancient Indian furnaces, fueled by charcoal and powered by bellows, couldn't achieve these temperatures. Casting was impossible. So Indian blacksmiths developed forge welding, a technique that allowed them to work with iron below its melting point, shaping and joining pieces in their red-hot, malleable state. This wasn't a limitation. It was an innovation that gave ancient India the ability to create wrought iron structures of a size and quality that European smiths wouldn't match for more than 1,000 years. The ancient Indians were the only non-European people to manufacture massive forged iron pieces, and they did it centuries before Europeans developed similar capabilities. Chinese metallurgy, for comparison, took a different path. Chinese smiths developed blast furnaces that could achieve temperatures high enough to melt iron, allowing them to create cast iron objects. China was producing cast iron by 500 BC, over 800 years before Europe. Cast iron could be poured into molds, making it easier to create complex shapes. But cast iron is brittle, prone to cracking, and cannot be worked or shaped after casting. India's wrought iron, created through forge welding, was tougher, more ductile, and could be shaped and refined through hammering even after the initial construction. It was also purer, with lower carbon content, making it more resistant to certain types of corrosion. The techniques used to create the Delhi iron pillar represent the culmination of centuries of Indian metalworking tradition. Archaeological evidence shows that iron working in India dates back to at least 1800 BC, during the second millennium BC, contemporary with the Indus Valley civilization's later phases. By the time of the Gupta Empire, Indian smiths had refined their techniques over nearly 2 millennia. They knew which iron ores produced the best metal. They knew which woods created charcoal with the right burning characteristics. They knew the precise temperatures needed for different operations. They knew how to control slag formation, how to achieve proper welds, how to create surface finishes appropriate for different purposes. This knowledge wasn't written in books. It lived in the craft tradition, passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. Young smiths would spend years learning to judge temperature by colour, to hear in the ring of a hammer strike whether the weld was taking properly, to feel in their muscles the rhythm of coordinated hammering that created perfect joints. The organisation required to forge the Delhi iron pillar speaks to sophisticated project management capabilities. Someone had to coordinate 120 workers, ensure constant supplies of charcoal and ore, maintain multiple furnaces at proper temperatures, sequence the welding operations so that each piece joined correctly to the growing structure, and supervise the finishing work that created the final polished surface. This wasn't a small village forge creating tools and weapons. This was an industrial scale operation, probably sponsored directly by the royal court, bringing together master smiths from across the empire to create something unprecedented in size and quality. The fact that the pillar's composition remains relatively uniform throughout its height, despite being built from hundreds of individual pieces welded over 2 weeks, demonstrates remarkable quality control. The smiths maintained consistent ore sources and smelting practices throughout the project, ensuring that each piece of iron had similar phosphorus content and purity levels. Modern replication studies have attempted to recreate ancient forge welding techniques. The challenges are immense. Maintaining proper temperature control without modern thermometers, achieving sufficient impact force with hand hammering, creating welds strong enough that the joint is indistinguishable from the surrounding metal. These require skills that take years to develop. Some modern blacksmiths have successfully forge welded smaller objects using traditional techniques, but nothing approaching the scale of the Delhi iron pillar has been attempted. The logistical challenges alone, coordinating that many workers, maintaining temperatures across that long a construction period, would be formidable even with modern equipment. But how did this construction method contribute to rust resistance? That remained a mystery through Ghosh's work and for decades afterward. The phosphorus content, the forge welding technique, the embedded slag particles from the smelting process. These were clues, but they didn't fully explain why the pillar remained pristine after 600 years of exposure. The breakthrough came in 2003 at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. Professor R. Balasubramaniam, a metallurgical engineer who had devoted years to studying ancient Indian metalwork, published findings in the journal Current Science that would finally solve the mystery. Balasubramaniam wasn't the first scientist to examine the pillar. Far from it. The Delhi iron pillar had been attracting scientific attention since 1912, when British metallurgists first conducted chemical analyses. In 1961, researchers dug around the base for chemical treatment and preservation, discovering the pillar's underground structure, a bulb-shaped bottom, much like an onion, with 8 short, thick rods attached to anchor it firmly in the earth. In 1969, the pillar briefly gained notoriety when Erich von Däniken, in his controversial book Chariots of the Gods, cited it as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. Von Däniken claimed the absence of corrosion proved that ancient aliens must have provided the technology. When an interviewer informed him in 1974 that the column was not in fact completely rust-free and that its method of construction was actually well understood through historical metalworking practices, von Däniken admitted he no longer considered the pillar mysterious. But by then the alien theory had already captured public imagination, demonstrating how easily unexplained ancient achievements get attributed to supernatural or extraterrestrial sources rather than human ingenuity. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, various researchers proposed theories. Some focused on environmental factors, others examined the iron's purity, but none had the complete picture. The technology to truly understand the pillar at a molecular level simply didn't exist yet. By the 1990s, Professor Balasubramaniam had begun his systematic study. He approached the pillar not as a curiosity, but as a teaching tool, a window into ancient metallurgical practices. He published multiple papers analysing different aspects: the construction techniques, the decorative bell capital, the inscription, the microstructure. Each study revealed another layer of sophistication, but the 2003 paper, published in Current Science, was the culmination. Balasubramaniam and his team didn't just analyse the iron, they analysed the rust, or rather, the thin film that covered the iron's surface, a film so thin it was barely visible, just 1/20th of a millimetre thick after 1,600 years. They took samples from the region just below the decorative bell capital, an area inaccessible to the public, where the rust had remained undisturbed for the full 600-year history of the pillar. This was crucial because samples taken from lower portions, areas that had been touched by thousands of hands over the decades, showed different characteristics. Human touch had worn away portions of the protective film, creating slightly different surface chemistry. Using X-ray diffraction, Fourier, transform infrared spectroscopy, and Mersbauer spectroscopy, three sophisticated techniques that can identify chemical compounds at molecular levels, they identified the exact chemical composition of this protective film. And what they found was extraordinary. The film consisted primarily of a compound called misoite, an iron oxyhydroxide, but more importantly, it contained crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate. This phosphate compound, forming a continuous layer at the interface between the iron and the atmosphere, created a passive protective barrier that prevented further oxidation. Here's how it works. When the pillar was first exposed to moisture and air, the iron began to oxidize, just like any iron would. But the high phosphorus content in the metal, combined with slag particles and unreduced iron oxides embedded in the microstructure from the forge welding process, triggered a series of chemical reactions that were anything but ordinary. The slag particles acted as cathodes, while the metal itself served as an anode, creating mini galvanic cells on the surface. This unusual electrochemical environment, combined with Delhi's alternating wet and dry conditions, the monsoons followed by long dry periods, enriched the metal scale interface with phosphorus. The phosphorus then reacted with iron and oxygen to form iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, which crystallized into a thin, dense protective layer. This layer, once formed, adhered tightly to the iron surface, creating a barrier that prevented moisture and oxygen from reaching the metal beneath. It's a self-healing system. When the pillar gets wet, the phosphate film slightly increases in thickness. When it dries, the film becomes more crystalline and protective. Over centuries, this process has built up a microscopic shield, just 20 microns thick. That's thinner than a human hair, but effectively immortal. Modern weathering steel uses similar principles, with copper and phosphorus additions to create protective rust layers. But these modern steels were developed in the 20th century, through decades of trial and error and sophisticated chemistry. The ancient Indian blacksmiths achieved something comparable 1,600 years ago, not through chemistry textbooks, but through empirical knowledge passed down through generations. The development of modern weathering steel is itself an interesting story that highlights how recently we've understood these principles. The first weathering steels were developed in the United States in the 1930s by USS Corporation, now US Steel. These early formulations added small amounts of copper, phosphorus, silicon, and chromium to standard steel, creating alloys that formed stable protective rust layers under certain atmospheric conditions. The key insight was that rust doesn't have to be destructive. Under the right circumstances, with the right alloying elements and the right environmental conditions, rust can be protective. The trick is creating a rust layer that's dense and adherent, that clings tightly to the metal surface and prevents oxygen and moisture from penetrating deeper. Modern weathering steels work well in environments with moderate humidity and regular wet-dry cycling, similar to Delhi's climate. They don't work as well in constantly wet environments or in marine atmospheres with salt spray. The environmental conditions matter enormously, which is why the Delhi iron pillar's location contributes to its preservation. But here's what's remarkable. Modern weathering steel typically takes 5 to 10 years to develop its full protective patina. During that initial period, the steel actually corrodes more rapidly than regular steel, going through what metallurgists call the weathering period. Structures made from weathering steel often look terrible for the first few years, covered in rust runoff, staining everything around them before the protective layer fully forms and stabilizes. The Delhi iron pillar, by contrast, seems to have developed its protective layer relatively quickly and maintained it consistently for 1,600 years. The ancient smiths somehow created conditions that promoted rapid protective film formation without the destructive weathering period that modern steels experience. Part of this may relate to the surface preparation. Ancient finishing techniques, using chisels and burnishing tools on hot metal, created a work-hardened surface layer with specific crystallographic properties. Modern metallurgical analysis has shown that this surface layer has different grain structure than the underlying metal, which may have promoted the formation of the protective phosphate film. The absence of certain elements is also crucial. The ancient iron contains essentially no sulfur or magnesium. Modern blast furnaces often introduce trace amounts of these elements, which can interfere with protective film formation. Sulfur, in particular, can cause problems because it forms iron sulfide inclusions that create local electrochemical cells, accelerating corrosion. The ancient smelting process, using charcoal in relatively low-temperature furnaces, naturally produced very pure iron with minimal contamination. Sulfur, present in many iron ores, gets removed during the prolonged heating and hammering process. The smiths didn't need to understand sulfur chemistry. They just needed to know that iron produced their way lasted longer than iron produced by shortcuts or inferior methods. This highlights a broader principle in traditional technologies. Effective practice can precede theoretical understanding. The ancient smiths developed techniques that worked reliably, even though they couldn't explain in modern chemical terms why those techniques were effective. The knowledge was empirical, built through observation and refinement over generations. Modern science often dismisses traditional practices as superstition or inefficiency, only to discover later that those practices embody sophisticated understanding expressed in different terms. The use of fermented foods for preservation, traditional architectural techniques for natural climate control, herbal medicines with genuine pharmaceutical properties. History is full of examples where traditional knowledge anticipated scientific discoveries by centuries or millennia. The Delhi iron pillar is perhaps the most dramatic example of this principle in metallurgy. The ancient smiths achieved a result that modern metallurgists, with all their theoretical knowledge and analytical tools, struggle to replicate using traditional methods. The craft knowledge, accumulated over generations, proved more effective in its specific domain than modern approaches developed without that accumulated wisdom. This should make us humble about our modern capabilities and more respectful of traditional knowledge systems. It doesn't mean ancient people understood everything, or that traditional practices are always optimal, but it does mean that traditions surviving centuries of practical use probably work for reasons worth understanding, even if practitioners can't articulate those reasons in modern scientific language. The phosphate film formation mechanism, discovered by Professor Balasubramaniam, has since influenced research into new corrosion-resistant materials. Some researchers are investigating whether similar protective mechanisms could be engineered into modern infrastructure, particularly in developing countries where expensive maintenance regimes for steel structures may not be feasible. Imagine bridges and buildings that develop their own protective coatings naturally, that require minimal maintenance, that could last centuries rather than decades. The principles embodied in the Delhi iron pillar could inform the development of such materials, translating ancient empirical knowledge into modern engineering practice. Several universities have undertaken projects to create neo-traditional iron using ancient Indian techniques. These experiments involve building small furnaces similar to ancient designs, using charcoal from specific wood species, smelting iron ore without lime flux, and forge welding the resulting iron blooms. The goal is to understand each variable in the process and how it affects the final product's properties. Results have been promising but also humbling. Researchers can create rust-resistant iron using these methods, but achieving the same uniform quality throughout a large structure, maintaining precise control over composition and processing conditions without modern instruments, proves extraordinarily difficult. The ancient smiths made it look easy because they had decades of experience reading visual cues, understanding subtle differences in ore quality, knowing exactly when conditions were right for welding. This expertise can't be quickly replicated. It takes time, practice, mentorship, the kind of apprenticeship training that was standard in traditional craft guilds, but is rare in modern industrial production. We have the theoretical knowledge to understand why the ancient techniques worked, but we lack the embodied skill to execute them reliably without extensive practice. How did they know to include high phosphorus? The answer lies in their choice of fuel and flux materials. Ancient Indian furnaces used charcoal made from specific woods, particularly Cassia auriculata, which has high phosphorus content in its ash. When smelting iron ore with this charcoal, phosphorus from the wood transferred into the iron. This wasn't accidental. Generations of smiths had learned that iron smelted with certain woods performed better, lasted longer, resisted the elements more effectively. They also didn't add lime to their furnaces. Modern blast furnaces use limestone as a flux, which helps separate impurities into slag. But limestone also removes phosphorus from the iron. The ancient smiths' choice to omit lime meant the phosphorus stayed in the metal, at exactly the concentration needed for the protective film to form. This wasn't written down in scientific journals. It was craft knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of metalworkers who knew what worked even if they couldn't explain the chemistry in modern terms. They knew that iron made a certain way, with certain materials, in certain conditions, possessed qualities that other iron did not. The forge welding process also contributed to the pillar's longevity. The repeated heating and hammering created a microstructure with embedded slag particles distributed throughout the iron. These second-phase particles, typically considered impurities, were actually essential to the protective film formation. They altered the electrochemical properties of the surface in ways that promoted the phosphate layer's development. Even the pillar's mass played a role. 6 tons of metal has significant thermal inertia. The pillar heats and cools slowly, reducing thermal stress and the formation of cracks that could compromise the protective film. Smaller iron objects, even those with similar composition, might not benefit from this mass effect. So the answer to the mystery isn't one thing. It's a perfect storm of factors working together. The pure wrought iron composition, the high phosphorus content, the absence of sulfur and magnesium, the embedded slag particles from forge welding, Delhi's climate with its wet-dry cycling, and the pillar's massive size. Remove any one of these factors and the pillar might have rusted like any other iron structure. But there's something even more remarkable to consider. The blacksmiths who created this pillar weren't working in isolation, making one lucky experimental piece. India, in the Gupta period, was producing rust-resistant iron on a large scale. The Delhi iron pillar is just the most famous example, but it wasn't the only one. Another iron pillar, shorter but also remarkably preserved, stands in Dar in Madhya Pradesh. Similar iron structures have been found in Karnataka. Ancient Indian iron artifacts scattered across museums show the same rust-resistant properties. This wasn't a fluke, it was a technology, a reproducible process that ancient Indian metallurgists had mastered and applied systematically. The implications are staggering. While medieval Europe was struggling with basic iron working, producing brittle cast iron or soft wrought iron that rusted rapidly, India had developed techniques for creating weather-resistant iron structures that would remain viable for millennia. The technical sophistication required for this achievement rivals anything in the ancient world. Consider what this means for our understanding of history. We often think of technological progress as linear, with each era building upon the last, always moving forward. But the iron pillar stands as proof that ancient civilizations achieved technical feats that were then lost, not to be rediscovered or replicated until the modern era. Damascus steel, with its legendary strength and distinctive watered pattern, was a technology lost for centuries until modern metallurgists finally understood the precise carbon nanotube structures that gave it properties superior to medieval European steel. Roman concrete, which has outlasted modern concrete in structures like the Pantheon and the Colosseum, used volcanic ash in a way that created a chemical reaction, making it stronger over time, a process modern engineers only recently decoded. The iron pillar joins this pantheon of ancient wonders that humble our modern pride. It reminds us that our ancestors weren't primitive craftsmen stumbling through trial and error. They were sophisticated engineers with deep, empirical understanding of the materials they worked with. But here's what makes the pillar's story particularly poignant. This technology was lost. By the time India entered the medieval period, the specific practices that created rust-resistant iron had faded. Later Indian ironworks corroded normally. The knowledge hadn't been written down in treatises or manuals. It lived in the hands and minds of master craftsmen, passed from generation to generation through apprenticeship and demonstration. When those lineages of craftsmen were disrupted by wars, invasions, and social upheaval, when the economic conditions that supported specialized metalworking changed, when patronage shifted to other technologies, the specific combination of practices that produced rust-resistant iron simply stopped. And the secret stopped with it. It took until 2003, using modern analytical chemistry and electron microscopy, for scientists to finally understand what those ancient smiths had achieved through experience and observation. We can now explain the chemistry, write equations for the reactions, model the protective film formation, but could we recreate it? Could modern metallurgists make another Delhi iron pillar? Yes and no. We could certainly make rust-resistant iron using similar principles. Modern weathering steel does exactly that, using copper, chromium, and phosphorus to create protective rust layers. But could we forge a 6-ton pillar using only charcoal furnaces and hand hammering without modern tools, following the exact ancient process? That would be extraordinarily difficult. The knowledge exists, but the craft has been lost. The feel of iron at exactly the right temperature for forge welding. The rhythm of 120 hammers working in coordination. The skill to maintain uniform composition throughout hundreds of welds. These aren't things you learn from textbooks. They're embodied knowledge, muscle memory, intuitive understanding developed over a lifetime of practice. And this raises profound questions about what else we've lost. How many other ancient technologies, equally sophisticated, have vanished without leaving obvious traces? The iron pillar survived because it's big, impressive, and inexplicably rust-free, which made people notice and preserve it. But what about smaller objects, more subtle achievements, technologies that left no such obvious calling card? Archaeological sites across India have yielded ancient iron objects with unusual properties. Some show evidence of surface treatments, possibly early forms of case hardening. Others display decorative patterns created through controlled oxidation. Still others seem to have been selectively hardened, with cutting edges harder than the body of the tool, a technique that requires precise heat treatment. Each of these represents knowledge, accumulated over generations, refined through countless iterations, and most of it is gone, surviving only as physical artifacts that we can study but cannot fully understand or replicate. The Delhi iron pillar also tells us something important about the Gupta period itself. This was a civilization at its peak, confident enough to undertake massive projects, wealthy enough to marshal the resources, technologically advanced enough to execute them flawlessly. The pillar was erected as a victory monument, a celebration of military conquest and divine devotion, but it's also a demonstration of capability. Chandragupta II wanted a structure that would last forever, that would proclaim his glory and his piety to generations yet unborn. His craftsmen delivered. They created something that has outlasted his empire by 1,000 years, that stands today as a testament not just to one king, but to an entire civilization's technical mastery. During Chandragupta II's reign, India was at the forefront of multiple fields: mathematics, astronomy, literature, art, architecture, metallurgy. The Gupta period saw advances across the spectrum of human achievement. The iron pillar is the physical embodiment of this golden age, a perfect synthesis of art, engineering, and scientific understanding. The Sanskrit inscription celebrates military victories and religious devotion, but the pillar itself celebrates something equally important: human ingenuity, technical excellence, the power of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations and refined to near perfection. Today, the pillar draws visitors from around the world. Conservation authorities have erected a fence around it because, ironically, human touch posed a threat that 600 years of weather did not. Thousands of people would place their hands on the pillar, trying to wrap their arms around it, a popular practice that was slowly wearing away the protective film at hand height. That portion of the pillar, touched by countless hands over decades, was beginning to show slight discoloration. So now, visitors can only look, can only photograph, can only marvel from a distance at this ancient achievement. The pillar stands behind its protective barrier, still rust-free, still defying the elements, still keeping its secrets, even as science has finally explained them. But what mysteries remain? For all we've learned, questions linger. We know how the protective film works, but we don't fully understand why only this specific combination of factors produces such remarkable results. We know the pillar was moved from Udayagiri, but we don't know exactly how. We know it was erected to honour Vishnu, but the deeper religious and cultural significance of the site, the rituals that might have accompanied its erection, the full context of its creation, these are lost to time. The pillar itself has become a symbol, interpreted and reinterpreted through the centuries. For Hindu devotees, it remains a sacred object, a monument to divine power and kingly devotion. For Muslim rulers who preserved it, it was a trophy representing the glory of conquered civilizations. For British colonial scientists, it was a puzzle that challenged their understanding of chemistry and metallurgy. For modern Indians, it's a source of national pride, proof of ancient sophistication. And for metallurgists worldwide, it's a case study in how traditional knowledge, developed through careful observation and empirical testing over generations, can achieve results that rival or exceed modern scientific approaches. The story of the iron pillar is ultimately a story about knowledge, how it's created, how it's preserved, and how it's lost. The blacksmiths who forged this pillar didn't understand oxidation in chemical terms. They didn't know about phosphate films or electrochemical reactions, but they knew iron. They knew which trees produced the best charcoal, which ores yielded the purest metal, which techniques produced iron that would endure. That knowledge took centuries to develop. It was hard won through experimentation, through failure, through careful observation of what worked and what didn't. It was valuable knowledge, the kind that gave civilizations competitive advantages, that enabled the construction of superior tools and weapons and monuments. And it was fragile knowledge, not written down, not formalized into scientific principles. It existed only in the minds and hands of craftsmen. When those craftsmen disappeared, when the chain of knowledge transmission broke, the understanding vanished. This is why the iron pillar matters beyond its technical achievement. It's a warning and a lesson. The warning is that civilizations can lose capabilities, that progress isn't inevitable, that knowledge can be forgotten. The lesson is that traditional practices often embody sophisticated understanding, even when practitioners can't explain that understanding in modern scientific terms. Throughout history, colonizers and modernizers have dismissed traditional techniques as primitive, replacing them with supposedly superior modern methods. Sometimes this is genuine progress, but sometimes, as with the rust-resistant iron of ancient India, traditional methods incorporate subtleties and wisdom that modern approaches miss. The story of the Delhi iron pillar has become famous in materials science, cited in textbooks as an example of how ancient technologies can still teach modern engineers valuable lessons. Universities around the world study it as a case of empirical knowledge, leading to results that theoretical science later struggles to explain and replicate. But the pillar itself remains in Delhi, standing in the courtyard of the Qutub complex, surrounded by ruins that tell their own stories of rise and fall, creation and destruction, memory and forgetting. The complex is a palimpsest of history. Hindu temples demolished to build a mosque, which itself fell into ruins, which now stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by millions. Through it all, the iron pillar endures. Chandragupta II is gone. His empire crumbled. The Gupta Golden Age ended. Delhi has been conquered and reconquered, ruled by sultans and Mughals and British and now independent India. The world has gone through medieval darkness and Renaissance and Industrial Revolution and Information Age. And still the pillar stands, still rust-free, still pristine, still mysterious in its perfection. When you look at the pillar today, you're looking at more than a remarkable feat of ancient metallurgy. You're looking at a time capsule, a message from a civilization that wanted to say, we were here, we were great, we understood things deeply, we created beauty and wonder. Remember us. The ancient blacksmiths succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Their creation has outlasted everything around it. It has transcended its original purpose as a religious monument and military trophy to become something universal. A testament to human capability, to the power of knowledge, to the sophisticated achievements possible when observation, experience, and skill combine. Every year, as the monsoon rains wash over Delhi, water beads up and runs off the iron pillar's surface. The wet-dry cycles continue, just as they have for 1,600 years. The protective phosphate film grows atom by atom, imperceptibly thickening. The pillar stands, silent witness to the centuries flowing past. Scientists now understand the chemistry. They can explain the reactions, write the equations, model the protective mechanisms. But knowledge isn't the same as wisdom. We know how the pillar works, we know why it doesn't rust, we can explain it with precision. But could we have invented it? Could modern metallurgists, starting from first principles, have designed this specific combination of composition, processing, and form to achieve 1,600 years of rust resistance? Perhaps eventually, with enough experimentation. But the ancient smiths got there first, guided by tradition, experience, and an intuitive understanding of their materials that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. That's the final mystery of the Delhi iron pillar. Not how it works, that's been explained. But how did they know? How did ancient craftsmen working without modern chemistry, without electron microscopes, without controlled experiments, develop techniques that achieved results modern science struggles to replicate? The answer is time and attention. Generations of metalworkers, each building on the knowledge of their predecessors, each observing carefully what worked and what didn't, each passing that accumulated wisdom to the next generation. Over centuries, this process refined techniques to near perfection, creating an empirical science more effective in its specialized domain than modern approaches developed in isolation from practical experience. The pillar stands as a monument to this process, to the power of traditional knowledge, to the sophisticated understanding possible when craft and attention combine over generations. It reminds us to be humble about our modern capabilities, to recognize that ancient achievements often represent hard-won wisdom we ignore at our peril. And it endures, through monsoons and droughts, through summer heat and winter cold, through 1,600 years of human history playing out around it. The Iron Pillar of Delhi stands unchanging, rust-free, eternal, a mystery solved but never diminished, a testament to ancient genius that continues to inspire wonder in everyone who encounters it. The blacksmiths who forged this pillar died long ago. Their names are forgotten. We don't know their faces, their stories, their individual contributions, but their work remains. And through their work, they achieved a kind of immortality that kings and emperors can only dream of. Their creation still stands, still challenges, still amazes, still teaches us about what's possible when human skill reaches its highest expression. That's the ultimate legacy of the Delhi Iron Pillar. Not just a rust-free structure, but proof that ancient peoples were capable of extraordinary sophistication, that traditional knowledge contains depths we're still exploring, and that sometimes the old ways embody wisdom that took centuries to develop and cannot be quickly replicated. The pillar will stand for centuries more, protected now by law and conservation efforts, preserved as the treasure it is. Future generations will study it, marvel at it, perhaps unlock even deeper secrets from its composition and structure. But the essential mystery, the wonder of it, will remain, because standing before the iron pillar, understanding the chemistry and metallurgy, knowing how and why it resists rust, you still feel it. That sense of awe, that recognition of extraordinary achievement, that connection across 1,600 years to the craftsmen who looked at iron and saw not just a metal, but a material they could master, transform, and make eternal. That's the true magic of the Delhi Iron Pillar. Not supernatural, not inexplicable, but no less wonderful for being understood. The chemistry is remarkable. The engineering is impressive. The longevity is astounding. But the real achievement is human. The accumulated knowledge, the skilled hands, the patient refinement over generations that allowed ancient Indian blacksmiths to create something that would outlast empires and still stand today, challenging us to remember that our ancestors were not primitive, that ancient peoples achieved wonders, and that sometimes the old ways hold secrets we're still learning to appreciate.